Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tonellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I have made it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. The world of fan fiction or fanfic is one I venture to suggest not everyone is familiar with. But the world over, avid fans of fictional universes like the world of Harry Potter, Twilight, Star Wars, Pokemon, Doctor Who, Outlander, and so many more live on in the hands of fans who write their own fiction featuring the characters and the worlds occupied by these novels, TV shows, films or games, and who then post these stories on the internet. The place superfans occupy, whether it's in the world of fanfic or more overt spaces like Comic-Con, is real and ever on the rise, as we will hear about today from our guest author, Katharine Pollock. Katharine holds a PhD in creative writing from Western Sydney University and is the program manager at Writing New South Wales. Katharine contributes regularly to The Guardian Online and has been published by Fremantle Press, Vitagraph Publishing and Folly Journal, amongst many others. Katharine's debut novel, Her Fidelity, was published by Penguin Random House in 2022, a book I loved and for which Katharine and I had a fabulous conversation for the podcast a few years ago now. But this year, Katharine has a new novel out. Starry Eyed, recently published by Wakefield Press, is a delightfully clever, humorous, sometimes laugh-out-loud novel about one woman's quest to figure out who she is and, more importantly, who she wants to be. Now, Katharine describes herself as being the writer of funny stories about ordinary people leading complicated lives, and nothing could be more true of Starry Eyed. So without further ado, let me welcome you back to the podcast, Kathy.
Thank you so much, Claudine. I'm really thrilled to be back. It feels like yesterday and also a lifetime ago that we were last chatting formally, at least.
It's actually been nearly 3 years since we chatted on the podcast. And I agree. It feels like forever, but almost a blink of an eye in other ways.
Absolutely. I keep thinking that it was 2 years ago that Her Fidelity came out, and then I have to catch myself and say, oh, no, it's just that I'm in my 30s and time is zipping by. But I'm truly thrilled to be back.
And I'm thrilled to be talking with you. And I was delighted to be able to attend the sparkly launch of this fantastic book last month at Better Read Than Dead, where you were in conversation with the talented Jane Badley. What a terrific night that was. But I gather you've done more events to promote and celebrate the book since then. So what's the feedback or response you're getting about the book? And is it everything you hoped it would be?
Yeah, it's always such an exciting time. I know that some authors who are, perhaps have been in the game for longer than me might be a bit jaded or not enjoy it, but I find it always such a delight to, be making the rounds on a book tour and just getting out there and being able to share the words with my readers. A lot of, I think, the readers for this book have kind of followed me from the first book, which is really special. But I've certainly met some new readers, new to me, along the way, which has been really exciting. So I've taken it to Brisbane and had a bit of a homecoming there because I'm a Queensland girl historically, and it got a really good turnout, and it was just a really fabulous time, and going into all the bookshops and chatting with the booksellers. It's just been delightful. And then I'm off to Melbourne this week, so we'll see how they feel about me that side of the border. But so far I've been getting a really generous response from readers. It's in some ways I think an unusual premise and, maybe a little difficult to categorize. So it's been really interesting seeing, how people have been responding to it as they've discovered it.
I feel certain the response to this book will be just as enthusiastic as it has been in Sydney and in Brisbane.
I think so. And, it's not about the numbers of people that show up. I was very lucky to have pretty big crowds show up to the Brisbane and Sydney launches, which was just a big surprise and really delightful. But it's more also felt that when I've gone and done events, it's felt like a bit of a homecoming of, friends and family and colleagues. And it's just such a lovely kind of experience. It's such a great world to be a part of. So I'm very grateful.
That's wonderful. Now, Kathy, I've already set the scene for some of the themes that you address in this book, but I wondered if you could tell us more about the story.
Yeah, definitely. It is very much set in this world of kind of fandom and specifically sci-fi film fandom in this instance. And so our main character, Adeline Acker, is really obsessed, I think is the only word that you can use, with this sci-fi film director from the 1990s called Josh Jolly Courtney. She's, I would say, equally as obsessed with him, with the man, perhaps with the myth, maybe not the legend, as it might transpire, as she is with his creation, with his kind of seminal, semi-feminist, I would say, kind of cult sci-fi film, Scarlet Fever. So she's got a real soft spot in her heart for this film that she saw when she was a young person, kind of going through some very heavy duty things in her home life, her personal life. And I think it is those formative years when we discover, whether it's a book, a film, even a painting that resonates with us and strikes a chord. It's very often that we'll sort of continue loving those texts or pieces of art for the rest of our lives. So that's very much what happens to Adeline, and it is very much what has happened to me. So I think that speaks to this, I suppose, the origins of this story. I like to joke that it might shock people that I'm a bit of a nerd. I'm, pretty transparently a fan. And in my first book, it was music that I was exploring, my kind of connections with music. And in this book, whilst it's certainly a film that I've created in my mind, Scarlet Fever, it's, standing in for all those films and TV series that I myself have loved when I was younger, that really, helped me through my own, different moments in my formative years as well.
Yeah, fantastic. So, yeah, you mentioned the fact that you've created this film that Adeline obsesses about and becomes this like super fan of in the book. And the film is called Scarlet Fever. So I wondered if you could tell me about Scarlet Fever and this cosmic universe you've created for Adeline in this book. What inspired this world and its language? Because it's very unique. And so I kind of then wondered, are you a closet sci-fi writer?
I think I might have discovered that I was whilst writing this. I didn't sort of think that I was before. I find it hard to kind of determine the starting point of where the film came from, because I think in some ways it was partly a sort of a pastiche and interpolation of different things that I've seen and loved. But I think I also wanted to play with not just things I'd seen and loved, but things I'd seen and that I found a bit cringeworthy as well, so that I could both celebrate and send up that particular sort of sci-fi. I'm pretty well versed in terms of reading and watching things in that genre. So I think I kind of just knew what to sort of absorb and almost transpose onto the text. And it just, once I started writing this world, I got carried away and it took on a life of its own, which so often happens. But it was very fun because I was able to invent a film and its own kind of universe, even so far as what its fans have come up with it. So sort of Wikipedia type pages and fan websites and all sorts of fan theories and academic articles. It really just came alive in my mind, which was really fun. And I almost forgot it wasn't real at a certain point. But I was also able to transplant that into the other fictional world, which is Adeline, the protagonist's world, and her relationship to this film. So there were kind of many layers, and I had to sometimes almost slow myself down in the writing to, make sure I was not losing the thread so much, because it was a sort of story that I didn't plan to be quite so ambitious, for want of a phrase. But I think in the end, it's a simple story, perhaps thematically at its heart in some ways, but I think the construction of it was a bit more complex than what I'd written before in terms of novel writing.
Yeah, I love that. I think it is, you're absolutely spot on with that. Thematically, it is a fairly simple story, but I love that what you've done is you've created a story within a story. And much like in Her Fidelity, you've kind of inhabited the world that you were writing about. So yeah, I completely agree with you. Thematically simple, but in the actual writing of it must have been so incredibly complex, because as you say, you've created this really complex world and a language, a look, a feel of this world, plus its own fans and all these sort of extrapolations, as you say. I guess the next question that I wanted to ask you was, have you dabbled in fan fiction yourself?
Yeah, it's so interesting because the honest answer is no, not really. And I think that surprises people when I say that. And honestly, it almost surprises myself. I have done a few small pieces here and there. There is definitely some dubious poetry out there. I had to sort of take a moment, take a breath there, because it's so embarrassing. That I wrote sort of almost like romantic odes to one particular sci-fi film director that was a bit of an inspiration in this book, which might be something we'll touch on. But I definitely in my youth have written some things where I was more, I would say, uncritically fanatical about some of the things I would consume, so there was sort of this parasociality or almost sort of idolization that I would have towards certain writers, directors, actors, and then had to kind of unlearn some of that and realize they were humans, which of course for you, Claudine, you'd know this, but for readers who haven't picked it up yet, is very much replicated in the pages of this story as well. Yeah.
Indeed.
But I
Indeed.
certainly know friends who have written fan fiction and I beg them to let me read it, but they it's lost to the tumblers of time, I think.
Back in the day, when Twilight came out and my two oldest children were interested in reading it, and I started reading it myself and was surprised to learn there was this huge fandom universe out there. I had no idea about it. People who are writing fan fiction who'd written, what they thought should have happened between Bella
Yeah.
and Edward, or, Bella and Jacob. And it is a real thing, and it's so important to so many people.
And it's often that kind of shipping fantasy, as they call it. It's often the romantic couplings. And, there's a whole website, don't ask me how I know this, called Lit Erotica, which is exactly what it sounds like on the tin that I discovered, which is, funny. And some of it is terrible and tragic, and some of it's deeply problematic, and some of it's unexpectedly quite clever and funny and beautiful, and it's a real hoot to explore. I haven't written fan fiction as such, but I've definitely written creative nonfiction pieces in which I've spoken about my connection to some of my favorite things, favorite TV series and films. And I think perhaps for me, I've been more interested in telling my own stories. It's a blurry line, I think, in that my stories have been shaped by the popular culture that I've consumed. Nothing exists out of a vacuum, but I've tended to, write something that's a few steps removed, I would say.
When we meet Adeline, she's working in a dead-end job. She's quite reserved, and she's really concerned about making herself as small as possible while living a small, contained life, on the outside at least. Now, on the inside, as you alluded to, she's living a very different life, one in which she's completely obsessed by this 90s sci-fi cult film classic, which we talked about, Scarlet Fever, and the man who wrote and directed it. And now, talking about sort of uncritically consuming popular cultures, this is Adeline to a T. She also administers the fan site that's dedicated to Josh Courtney, and she writes her own fan fiction under a pen name, of course. And what I especially love about this book is that Adeline's fanfic is actually in the book. So we get a glimpse into the world in which she's immersed, both figuratively and literally. So I wanted to ask you, Kathy, was that important to you? Was it always the way that you planned it, to have these fanfic pieces reproduced in the book?
Yeah, it was actually. That was something that was in there from the beginning. So originally, the first draft or couple of iterations of this novel, the manuscript was quite different in that it had a lot of things going on. So it had the fan fiction, but a lot more of it, because I really did get carried away with writing it. And I found it, such a hilarious and fun process to be writing it. In a lot of ways, it was a lot easier than writing the novel itself. In terms of its, I suppose, it was very tropey, and so it was easier to write in that way. But I also originally had things like footnotes with hyperlinks to websites and to, literary journals that I had invented. I had screenplay elements starting each chapter. There was a lot of everything, and I stripped, I would say, 99% of that back. I do sort of wish I'd kept in some of the footnotes between us and all of the listeners because I just finished reading Jodi McAllister's An Academic Affair, and it makes such great use of footnotes. And I thought, should have stuck to my guns. But but I do think that just having the fan fiction allows it to have its, moment in the sun. So I think it's actually for the best at the end of the day. But I wanted to include some element of that while stripping most of it away. Most of it was bogging the story down and making it a bit too noisy. And it was a bit, I guess, showing off a little bit too much, I think, in retrospect. But the fan fiction, I felt, is very important because it's Adeline telling her own story before she is able to really articulate it. She isn't quite emotionally capable of recognizing who she is, let alone what she's gone through for a long time. And she sort of writes it through the lens of this fan fiction. So it served that purpose. And then on a secondary level, I think for me, it was a way to say what the movie Scarlet Fever was about without boring readers to tears, because I think it is a movie that I've invented. And whilst it's real to my head, if no one's seen it, they're not really going to be interested in recaps or synopses of a film that never existed. So I think in this way, I could explore that film in a much funnier, more entertaining way.
Going back to Adeline's character, she's clearly an intelligent woman, and she's a talented writer, even though some of what she writes about can't exactly be categorized as feminist, she lacks confidence in almost every aspect of her life, despite all of this. And as I said earlier, she kind of lives this really small life. So I wondered if you could give us a bit of background on Adeline and why she is where she is when we meet her.
Yeah, definitely. So Adeline is 30 years of age at the beginning of the book. She's, as you said at the top of the podcast, she's working a fairly dreary job in a call center. There's some kind of situational comedy elements there, but only really to the reader. To her, it's quite bleak. She lives alone with only her pet rabbit, who is, basically her best friend, basically her only friend until her life takes a turn. And then she has a very strained relationship with her mother, Melanie, who's quite a difficult woman. I don't think it's too far to say she's quite mean and cold towards her daughter. There is a great loss there in that Adeline's father is no longer in the picture. He passed away, and this is revealed fairly early on, so that's not a major spoiler. And she just has a whole lot of other, I think, cumulative traumas, big and small, from high school bullying through to someone that lectured her at university, kind of quashing her dreams and diminishing her intellect. And I think all of these things just happened too young and too frequently for someone like her to bounce back. She just didn't have the resilience that maybe other people have, or that other people learn to develop. And I think that that's something that probably most people can relate to. Certainly for myself, there are various comments that have been made, leveled at me, that the person who said them wouldn't even remember me, let alone what they said, but they just have stuck in my brain. And I think, unlike Adeline, I can at least intellectualize myself out of that by saying it's about them, not about me, or who knows what they were going through, all of those things we can do with hindsight. But for Adeline, she definitely has the capacity to get there, but it does take her a long time to kind of move past this diminished sense of self that she's developed since she was young. So I think I agree with you. I think she does have the capacity to be quite intelligent in both the sort of a book smart way, as well as have an emotional intelligence that in some ways is more heightened than other people. But at least initially when we meet her, it's quite the opposite. She is a little bit frustrating, a bit of a hard nut to crack at first. And she really sort of stays in her lane and, has her little habits and rituals and doesn't break out of that, except, as we've said, when she's immersed in her head, sort of revisiting this film that she so adores and imagining herself as this kind of sci-fi heroine, jetting off around the universe, in her rocket ship, which is, the most exciting thing for her to imagine.
So, with all of that in mind, Kathy, it's no surprise that, and indeed it's not a spoiler to say, that when Adeline gets this opportunity to interview her idol, Josh Courtney, on stage for New York City's Cosmic Con, she not only jumps at the opportunity, but promptly jumps into bed with him too. Suffice it to say that this experience is the fulfillment of a long-held fantasy for Adeline, but Josh is not who she thinks or thought he would be. Tell us about what happens to her and about this meeting with Josh.
Yeah, definitely. And as you said, it's not a spoiler. The first page in the book opens with a rather naughty scene between Adeline and Josh. And I did that very purposefully in that, one, I think it's a great hook, on a sort of structural thematic level. But I also sort of wanted to plant the seed that whilst things are going to get a little bit dark and dreary for a few pages after this, there's this sort of knowledge that the readers can have that things are going to get a lot more exciting and comedic and fraught and complicated, but in kind of fun, exciting ways. In regards to her relationship with Josh and how she ends up, having this affair, I think she almost feels like she's manifested it. She's been so obsessed for so long that she can't believe she's even in the same room as him, let alone, having a sexual relationship with him. And so again, it takes her a long time to kind of accept that he's not what he seems. She certainly has a sense of it in terms of how he treats her, as well as some other things that, transpire that she is very resistant to accepting at first, things that suggest that his behavior might not be in keeping with the persona he's constructed for himself in the public eye. And she's very resistant to accepting that or believing that for a very long time, because she wants to stay in, that sort of love bubble, that kind of, sexy, outlandish place that she's landed in.
I was going to just add that I think meeting and forming a sexual relationship with Josh, who is years her senior, by the way, sets Adeline
Mm.
down this path of self discovery and also her loss of innocence in many ways, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. And I didn't want to make her into a bit of a caricature in that she is, pretty, I guess, frumpy, or at least she sees herself that way. And she's, not confident. But I also wanted it to not be therefore, she's this sort of virginal nerd with glasses. And, for the record, I have glasses just for want of a description. She's actually quite a sexual person and she does have this rich interior life. She just doesn't really have the experience to match that, so to have that kind of wisdom and range, I suppose. And so yeah, she doesn't really even recognize that Josh, being so far her senior in not just years, but I think where he's at with his emotional and mental maturity perhaps is questionable, but I think that doesn't even occur to her at first. She doesn't have the concepts of power imbalances in relationships or anything quite that advanced, so she doesn't see it for what it is at all. And in fact, when she, is presented with relationships that might be more promising and more healthy, she kind of doesn't know what to make of them. I think, she is excited by them. She's not completely ignorant, but she is much more, I think, initially drawn to the charisma of a man like Josh, to her detriment at first. But I think, as you've said, it does ultimately become a really powerful and important learning experience for her in many, many ways.
You mentioned some work that you had based on a male director that perhaps you had admired in years gone by. And I guess, in reading about Josh Courtney in this book, it's not hard to imagine a man like him, a man who is seduced by his own fame and his own success, even though it's been years since he's produced any new work, a man whose inflated sense of importance and the fan adulation that he experiences allows him to behave abhorrently, really. And to that end,
Mm.
his character brings to mind many high profile men in the media and in the entertainment industry who've traded off their power and self importance. So, with your experiences in mind, was this something you were especially concerned to write about?
Yeah, definitely. I don't want to draw too many comparisons to my debut novel because it is, I think, in many ways quite different. But that novel too was concerned with, not to be reductive in a gendered sense, but generally speaking, men behaving badly in that world of music, in the case of Her Fidelity, and in this case, in the kind of film and TV fandom world. And I think the similarity there, it's really the same thing when you have legions of fans who are just sort of clamoring for your anything, your voice, your output. You are surrounded essentially by yes men and then also by vulnerable people and often kids. And so I think for a weak willed person or a manipulative person, that is very tantalizing and, can be taken advantage of. I think it is super common. And I think I definitely wanted to explore it, not just in a general sense, but also at the level of Josh is definitely, I would say, a bad man, capital B, bad. But he gets away with it for so long because there is a moral ambiguity there as well. And there's a charisma there as well. Particularly, I think men in these kind of very nerdy spaces, there's an association there with, intellect and empathy and femininity and all of these things that can allow them to sidestep allegations, to say, I'm a good guy, I take care of my fans, I'm a gentle person, I'm a feminist. And these are all things that Josh in the book would say about himself. And I was thinking about, allegations around, we have the extreme end of the spectrum, like your Harvey Weinstein allegations. And then we have things that are perhaps are rung down, like the allegations about Neil Gaiman. And then we have allegations about Joss Whedon, who directed Buffy the Vampire Slayer. There's a spectrum, I think, of moral, it's not even ambiguity, of moral reprehensible behavior. But I think what I find the most interesting is the allegations about men that are buried or, allowed to continue because they have a persona that is disingenuously nice or vulnerable. I'm not sure if that was quite articulate enough, but it's that idea of them not being a cartoonish villain that I find really dangerous and insidious and therefore really important to explore.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. And I think I was going to say a little bit earlier that, in many ways, despite a lot of ambiguity around Josh's behavior in the book, a lot of accusations that are being made that Adeline becomes aware of. And despite all of that, she continues to defend him and to make excuses for him. You know, she deletes negative comments about him from her fan site. She dismisses allegations of him, you know, touching somebody inappropriately, and just kind of says, oh, you know, he must just be a touchy kind of guy. You know, as you were saying, it's people who seem to be able to sidestep this stuff because they have that he's a good guy image. Oh, he's not that kind of guy. He's not the cartoon villain that people are more likely to attribute bad behavior to. But it's this kind of low level stuff that just keeps cropping up, and people just, oh, you know, it's just, he's just like that. And he seems to just be able to get away with it. And Adeline herself is guilty of excusing that behavior.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the other thing that relates to that, that I don't think I even knew I was exploring this, to be honest, until after I'd written it, but is that a lot of the times with these sorts of creators who are deeply problematic, it's often right there in front of us in their art, you know, in their depictions of women on screens. We will often look at things from, let's say, the early 2000s back and say, well, that's aged badly. But I think it was pretty bad from the beginning. We just didn't necessarily have the kind of, you know, vocabulary for it at the time. And it's definitely the same with Josh and Scarlet Fever, in that the depictions of women in his stories and of romantic love and monogamy are pretty fraught and problematic, and, you know, at best, just very cliched. And I think what makes it so difficult for Adeline to accept that he's bad is because she loves that movie so much. So it would even mean accepting that some of the things in the movie that she loves are problematic and fraught. And that's just a bridge too far for her in her, you know, initial explorations or interrogations as to what this all means. So it's very kind of convoluted and layered, I think, for many fans in that way. You know, even if it's just a passing affection that you have for a piece of art, to sort of accept that it's not 100% pure and, you know, perfect. The two pieces of pop culture I kind of continually go back to are, perhaps ironically, considering the director's name is one of the names I just mentioned there, Joss Whedon, but is Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and then is The X-Files. And I think it's because there are so many problematic things in both of those shows, whether it's, you know, they're not sort of racially, sexually, gender, in a gendered sense, diverse, or, you know, representational enough. But there's also, I think, things in there that are really impactful for young women and vulnerable people watching it. I always think about how many women or girls went into STEM after The X-Files came out, because Scully was a woman in science. And I think for all that show's flaws, that's really cool and really inspiring. And it's something that lives beyond the show and its creators, you know, who may or may not be problematic. Not specifically The X-Files. I don't think the creators of that show have any allegations about them, but we can still love these artifacts, you know, these texts, and hold them dearly. But I do think we have a responsibility to be critical of them as well, you know.
Absolutely. So I mentioned New York earlier as being kind of the start of Adeline's awakening. And in New York, she meets Sally, the foul-mouthed English bohemian, whom she instantly connects with. And also she meets Anthony, the co-owner of a comic store called Manhattan Man Comics. And it seems hard to believe that before them, Adeline never really had any friends apart from the pet rabbit Jolly, as you mentioned earlier. But as much as meeting Josh becomes a catalyst for her emotional metamorphosis, so does meeting Sally and Anthony, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely. I think insofar as her not really having anyone significant in her life before that, in my mind, whilst it's not written on the pages, she's had, you know, flirtations and she's had sort of experiences with friends, but I imagine Adeline pushing them away a little bit out of a, you know, a need to protect herself, perhaps, you know, a fear of judgment coming at her from all directions. You know, there's a scene in which I write about her preferring to pleasure herself than to hit the dating circuit, to put it euphemistically. And I say quite explicitly in her voice, albeit via the narrator, that she is just scared of being judged for being aloof or a bit weird. So I think she's in some ways completely unself-aware, but in ways like that, she's too self-aware to a fault. But I think what happens when she goes to New York is she's had this boost of confidence about being invited to attend the Cosmicon circuit and to interview her hero. And that sort of gives her a new vim and vigor for life. I think as well, she's away from the people who are the bane of her existence. You know, she's away physically from her very difficult mother, her pretty terrible boss and workplace. And she's away from her kind of cold, silent house as well, so she can reinvent herself in this, glamorous new scene that she finds herself in. So I think she's able to almost act like she is another character in a sense. She's not herself. She's not Scarlet Fever, but she's this sort of third person that can kind of just make a new life for herself, even if it's just for a few short weeks.
You mentioned Melanie, Adeline's mum, and you mentioned that she had a difficult relationship with Melanie. And I think the other big emotional arc in this story is the change in Adeline's relationship with her mother, so to speak. Melanie's difficulty is something that Adeline accepts, but she doesn't understand, and she grieves that relationship, doesn't she?
Yeah, I think, I mentioned that she's lost her father at a very young age and she grieves him, but she has perhaps fainter memories of that relationship. And she never had to see it spoiled in the sense of it didn't devolve into something toxic. He just suddenly wasn't there. And that's its own profound tragedy. With her mother, she was fairly vibrant and loving when Adeline was young. And, the scale of this calamity, of this tragedy, just fundamentally changed her. And so I think Adeline is constantly trying to accept that, and she can, as you say, recognize that, but she doesn't want to, put herself in harm's way over and over again by constantly bearing the ire, the brunt of her mother's ire. And I think sometimes she is shocked anew by just how harsh and cold her mother can be. And I think that is true for a lot of us. Even when we have fully accepted someone or say that we can still be hurt by them, over and over again. That's just human nature. And so I think for Adeline to change the trajectory of her relationship with her mother, which she does really want to, she has to get confidence in herself so that she can stick up for herself. But also she has to do that impossible thing of just hoping that the other person in the equation will also meet her in the middle as well, and that I think is a much more difficult thing because it's out of her control. It's out of anyone's control.
I mean, her relationship with her mother is important to her. And so, was this mother daughter dynamic something you expressly wanted to address in the novel?
Yeah, it was. And I was a little gun shy about it, I think, because I think we've all read or watched versions of the mother daughter relationship. And that could be the mother, the stepmother, the mother-in-law that's a bit of a harridan, and is cold and calculating. And particularly because the father wasn't in the picture, I was very mindful that this could fall into that trap of this sort of reductive, sexist and ageist dynamic. But I think nonetheless, it was really important for me to show that not just men had the capacity in Adeline's world to be either, angels or devils or something in between, but so could the women in her life. Because again, that's just the world that I think we exist in. So much of this novel is fantastical and silly and sexy, but I think that the core of it, I wanted to be not serious, but real and affecting as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, I hope I did achieve that. I mentioned that I had a book launch for this in Brisbane and my loving mum was in the front row and my mother-in-law was in the second row. And so I had to say, I promise this is not you. I've certainly received my own allegations that I've written about people without their permission, particularly with my first book. But hand to heart, this was not my experience. But again, it's just something that I think we've all observed, if not experienced some version of, even if it's not with our mothers per se.
Now, the New York that you show us in this book is not really the touristy New York. It's not the big apple where dreams are made or made possible. Perhaps a less showy New York. So was this intentional? Like, did you go there specifically with this story in mind, or did you write it based on memories of previous travel? Tell us about that.
I am the daughter of, I mentioned my mother, but I'm also the daughter of a pretty staunchly anti-imperialist father who, is constantly railing against America. And I think we probably all are doing a bit of that at the moment, if truth be told. But I also am the product of watching every single rom-com set in New York as well and just adoring them. So it does, like many people, hold a real soft spot for me of the world of possibility and of romance. But I wanted to sort of show that, much like everything else in Adeline's world, New York is not just this cartoon, page from a comic. It's much more complex. But I also wanted to show that, she can find the beauty in really small things. She finds the beauty in her beloved pet rabbit every day. When she's in New York, she finds the beauty in just experiencing a food she hasn't tasted or something like that. But I think also It's transparently just funny to show someone going to a place that they think is going to be the pinnacle of their dreams come true. And it's just a bit shit, if you'll excuse my language. And when I went to New York, I've only been once, and it was maybe 7 or 8 years ago. And I did have to stay in a hostel that was a little bit grimy and in some ways kind of similar to where Adeline stays when she's in New York. And the other truthful aspect is that it was just across the road from the infamous Chelsea Hotel, which I'm a music lover. And I thought, oh, Patti Smith was right there, but it was under scaffolding because they were reconstructing it. And I just thought, oh, so close, but no cigar. And I wanted to sort of explore those just little funny moments of, even when you go to New York and you think all your dreams have come true, you might not be able to get into the building because it's under scaffolding.
Oh, I absolutely love that. If there was one thing that you would most like readers to take away from this novel, what would that be?
I would like readers to take away, well, I think if I can answer that in two ways. One is, I've been speaking a lot about the fan fiction aspect and the sci-fi aspect, and I don't want that to be a deterrent to readers who maybe are not, as nerdy as I am, or who maybe occupy a different fandom. Because I think, fundamentally, that's the spoonful of sugar that helps the medicine go down around all the other, themes. At its heart, I think it's a rom-com, really, an exploration of platonic love and romantic love, I would say, and familial and self-love, all of it, really. Hopefully, readers could approach it, I suppose, in good faith and thinking that it's more than meets the eye. That's really its theme after all. In terms of after reading it, the takeaway that I would want readers to have is that even when we're at our worst, we have the capacity to do better and be better. That doesn't mean we're deserving of forgiveness always, but I think that we have to constantly see ourselves as being worthy of love and of giving love. That might be a bit trite or naff, but I really think that, without that, that's how we end up in a lot of the pretty horrible places that we are, culturally at the minute. And it's complex, but I think a lot of it is, if not preventable, something that we can work on within ourselves. And so hopefully this book shows a little bit of that message.
Since we last chatted, there's been some pretty big changes in your life, one of which was becoming program manager at Writing New South Wales. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about that role and what it entails.
Oh, sure. So, yes, I've been in that role for just over a year now, which is crazy. We're talking about the swift passage of time before, and that's certainly one of those things that's really sped by. Prior to that role, I was, as well as writing, obviously doing a lot of teaching. It's in some ways a natural transition in that now I help to curate and facilitate the program of events that teachers do, but specifically that, writers and professionals like yourself, Claudine. Little plug there for an upcoming amazing seminar with Claudine at the centre, but helping to put on that program of events. And most recently, we put on a really amazing young adult and children's literature festival, which was really exciting. So just sort of working with a small team to help bring these events to life. So it's really nice to be working directly within the writing scene in a really kind of, I hope, meaningful way.
Fantastic, fantastic. And so I wondered, I guess, how does that role align or fit with your current writing practice and your goals? Like, how do you fit in your own writing around facilitating these sort of, terrific program of events for writers around the country, really?
Yeah, I mean, I will admit that when I had more, I suppose, sessional work and casual work, it was easier to find the time to write transparently. And I have definitely slowed down quite a bit. Thankfully, I had quite a bit of writing sort of in the can already, so I'm okay. But I am trying to get back more into a regular groove. I am part-time in this role, so often I am still working the equivalent of full-time with supplementing my income with all sorts of different odds and ends. But I do try and write if I ever am only working 4 days or on the weekends. And I find I often have to do what I used to do during my PhD, which is get out of the house, go down to the library or the cafe, hopefully with a friend, and write in company at least for a couple of hours until it's done. So slowly but surely is my new method, which is a little different to how I've historically done it. But, we all go through seasons, I think, of productivity, and, that's okay.
So to that end, do you have it might seem a bit redundant to ask you, but do you have a particular writing routine to reach your writing goals, especially when you're on deadline?
I mentioned what I learned through my PhD before, and I think the main thing I learned was I used to feel really guilty. I may have even mentioned this back when we first chatted, but I used to feel very guilty if I didn't treat it like a 9-to-5 job. I realized that that is really impossible because some days your writing is going to be, 2,000 words on the page, and sometimes it's going to be staring at the screen in dread. And sometimes it's going to be watching your favorite sci-fi film for research, which is really fun. What I try and do is almost sort of time limits now rather than word count. So I'll say, I'm back to that really really old trick of just saying 15 minutes is all I need to do. Just sit here and write for 15 minutes. And almost always I end up being there for at least double that, if not quite a bit longer. And hopefully getting, I feel pretty good nowadays if I get about 1,000 words on the page. If I'm at a deadline, it might be more. And sometimes the words will pour forth and sometimes they won't. But I try to, lately I've been doing that more after work than before work. I'm not really an early riser. So that's just for me. But I think, different strokes for different folks. Someone asked me, because there is a playlist at the back of this book, they asked me at an event recently if I write with music, and I sometimes I write in quiet, but sometimes I do put on usually instrumental music, but just to kind of get into a groove. So all just those little tricks, I think, to try and coax yourself into, being somewhat productive. But happily, I don't dislike writing. I really do generally and genuinely enjoy it. But I think when you haven't done it as regularly and consistently for so long, it does feel like a chore, and you have to remember, or I have to remember, I'm doing this by choice and because I really love it. And that does help me to get back into the swing of things. And I often find doing things like this podcast or other sort of writing related things that aren't strictly speaking my work, even though, it does technically, I suppose, eat into your writing time, I also find it reminds me of what I love and gets me back into that headspace, and find that really rejuvenating as well.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I'm very glad that this could be an inspiring opportunity.
Next minute, I'll have bashed out 5,000 words after this. You'll see.
Kathy, given you have a PhD, given that you have been involved in teaching writing from time to time, and your role now as program manager at Writing New South Wales, which surely brings you in contact with lots of writers, I wondered if you had any writing tips for people out there who might be struggling with the idea of either sitting down to write or finishing that manuscript or even starting.
Every time I try and think of a bit of advice, it will sound like a cliche, but that is because they're tried and true things. Not to say they'll work for everyone, but they have worked for, a large amount of people. And I think the number one terribly cliched thing is practice makes perfect, which, leads directly to this idea that I've said this before, but perfectionism is the enemy of creativity. I'm a sort of a bit of a type A perfectionist in a lot of ways, and I really have to stop that part of my brain when I sit down to write and just let my writing be messy and unhinged, which is not to say you can't plot or, have the most detailed sort of Scrivener flowchart going, but you have to be able to relinquish control and just get into the flow state. And that's where I think, anything like free writing or journaling or morning pages helps to just get into that state of mind. I can't remember who said this. It was probably a notorious drunk like Hemingway, but that idea of writing sober and editing drunk, you don't have to edit drunk. I'm not saying I endorse that message, but certainly writing sober, not literally necessarily, but with a sober frame of mind, just being able to have clarity of mind, but balance that with a looseness. It sounds contradictory, but I think that's that sort of sweet spot in the middle of remaining open, but also committed. If you don't take your work seriously, it's not going to happen, and therefore no one will ever take it seriously. So, it's better to have a flawed piece of art than no art at all, I often think.
So, Kathy, what's next? Are you working on something else? Have you got something planned? Is something coming out next year? Tell us about it.
Nothing is coming out immediately, but hopefully there is a third novel that my agent has his hot little hands on. So with any luck, that will be making its way out into the world at some point soon. That is, again, sort of dipping into the romantic comedy sphere. But I think that all of my writing so far has elements of romance, a huge dose of comedy, but certainly a bit of an edge. So there's always a bit of a feminist edge or cheeky wink in there. So it's definitely in keeping with that. And then I am about 35,000 words into book number 4, which I'm really excited about and really itching to get back to writing whenever, swathes of time go by and I haven't tackled it. And it's probably the most, I would say, structurally ambitious thing that I've done, and has required a tiny bit of research, which I'm usually just kind of completely making things up, which is, very freeing and fun, but it's quite satisfying to be writing in a way that feels like my writing practice is evolving, which, is always the dream, I think, for all of us.
Do you think we'll see a return of Adeline Acker in any of your future novels?
I wonder. I think for right now, she's just doing her own thing. She's jetting back and forth, having an intercontinental life between New York and here, figuring things out and rebuilding her relationships. I think for me, I feel like her story is done. But who knows? Maybe she's going to become a famous actor and then she'll, turn the tables on everything and, have her revenge on that dastardly Josh. So who knows? She lives on in my head. I'm not sure yet if she'll live on in the pages.
Yeah, I'd love to know what else she gets up to at some point.
We'll see. I never thought I'd return to any characters that I'd already written, but I won't go into too much detail with what I'm writing at the minute, but there is a return of some of the characters that I've been writing about. So who knows? I won't ever close the door on any of them fully. If they come a knocking, I'll answer it.
Katharine, I so enjoyed reading Starry Eyed, and I cannot wait to see what you do next. Thank you so very much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
Thank you so much, Claudine. Always a pleasure chatting with you.
That's it for this episode, folks. Hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. If so, I'd love it if you'd leave a review on your preferred listening platform, which may include Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Amazon Music. Until next time, friends, happy reading.